Well, thank you and welcome everyone for being here. I'm glad to be here and talk to you today. That was a long intro. I'm Jeff. That's the better way to introduce myself. I'm going to start with a story on the rise and fall of a CISO. So about 20 years ago, there was a guy that worked as a network admin at a small or medium-sized financial institution. And one day, the OCC came in and said, you need to have a security program. And nobody else wanted that role. And this individual was told, kind of voluntold, you're now the security person. You're the security guy from this point forward. Right? Some of you may have had that experience in the past. So, still I can't hear? How close can I get it? Hold on one second. Is that better? All right. I'll try to look down. I can hear myself. Thank you. All right. So for the next 6 years, that individual, now it seems kind of loud, that individual spent 6 years building a security program with this organization, learned more than they probably could have ever imagined learning during that time from the ground up. Someone who loves to build things, that was a great role for that individual. 10 years more in the future to that, doing multiple roles from pen tester to architecture to risk manager, all the way to a director of security type role or leading a program for an organization. And one day this individual got an opportunity to go to a small private firm to be their first CISO, first VP, and CISO title role. I'm very excited about that. So day one of that role, walks in on the table is a laptop and one single piece of paper. And that piece of paper was the security program, right? Just a one-page policy. This is a pure build. And 3 years future into that, they built a great team. Team got along really well, very effective at getting things done. Built a data management program, a privacy program, some advanced solutions for MFA and adaptive authentication. Really got the security program to a really good spot. Ultimately, the business unit tied to that organization where they brought this role in for was eventually sold successfully, and the security program was no longer a detriment. It was a positive as part of that acquisition. So this individual was feeling great, providing a lot of value, felt like they were doing a really good job. And then one day they went into the CEO's office to do their weekly update on the program, to see an update of where things were at. And was actually thinking about talking about, maybe with all the value we provided, maybe SVP is on the table. Let's talk promotion, right? A lot of value has been produced here. And before that conversation could happen, the CEO said, Jeff, we're going to eliminate your position. Right? So if you hadn't figured it out already, it wasn't much of a secret. That story was about me. So for those of you who are Looney Tunes fans and can picture, when Bugs Bunny paints the fake tunnel on the wall, and Wile E. Coyote runs smack dab into it. That's pretty much how I felt walking out of that office that day. Big curveball, couldn't have seen that coming from a million miles away. So what did I do? I decided I was going to call it a day, and I started driving home. And then the emotions started kind of kicking in a little bit. First one was fear, and I was thinking about the 3 amazing kids I had at home, and my beautiful and very pregnant wife with our 4th child, and our new house payments, driving in the new car payment that I was driving home in, thinking, wow, my responsibility is to teach and provide, and I don't have a job. So that was a little concerning. Emotions also went from a little bit of anger, a lot of resentment. That one stuck for a while. Ultimately, it led back to pride, though. Felt like a failure, losing your job. I never lost a professional job before. That was a new one, a new curveball to deal with. So what did I do? Excuse me. Well, I hit the network, right? Started reaching out to everyone I know. And I see some faces in this room, even people that I reached out to during that time frame. And was humbled by the response and by the support from people on the network. A few weeks later, doing interviews, ultimately found a job, ultimately landed here where I am today at Freddie Mac. And we're doing amazing things. We have a great program, great support. I'm getting to build a cyber risk quantification program that I've wanted to build for over a decade. So ended up being a good event to happen. A couple things I learned during that story that jumped out to me. First was maintain your network. So if you can take one thing away from here today, find someone that you don't know, talk to them, connect with them on LinkedIn, because you don't know when you might need to use that network someday. 2 was, although I had resentment, when I look back at it now, it was the right decision, right? That after selling that business unit, my role was really no longer needed. And though I originally saw it as a failure, it actually wasn't. It wasn't a failure. Right? It was a compliment that the CEO gave me that was probably better than any compliment he could have gave me, which was, you worked yourself out of a job. Right? The program was good, and we feel like it can maintain with your team without you. What I realized also is I'd gotten kind of complacent. After a little bit of success and 3 kids maybe helped with that a little bit and focusing more on life and a little less on work, I stopped providing more value than I was expected to provide. And when you do that, things like getting let go happen. So it's something we should all strive for, is always continue to provide more value than you're expected to. So why did I open with a story like that? It's related to the conversation that I want to have here with you today. Now, Kim was a great introduction there. Wasn't supposed to give the full bio, resume intro. Because the point of introducing with the story is that hopefully it makes a better connection. Right? Someone in this room might have had a similar scenario to me, and now we have the start of a connection, and we can have a conversation maybe after this. So much more engaging than the thing that we all just listened to that was even kind of embarrassing to sit up here and listen to. Bullet point, have this certification, did this thing. We all do that. We all have that stuff. Right? So it's great to be here. It's been a couple of years since a lot of us have been out here, but since I've been up presenting live, done a number of virtual events, which I'm sick of virtual events. I don't know about all you. 2 years has gone by, and public speaking still terrifies me. Right? It's always been a fear, and 2 years of not doing it certainly didn't help that. But I'm also a huge fan of motivational speakers. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine turned me on to a lot of the motivational speakers on YouTube. I listen to them pretty regularly. It's really helped me kind of find my hunger and passion for life, really, but certainly into what I do for a living. And because it's scary, because it's hard, that's exactly why I'm up here speaking today. Right? So I hope I can provide something of value that you take away and a lesson learned. I'm also going to stretch it today, as Kim mentioned, and no slides. It's just going to be me, my ideas, which are not that of my employer. So I hope you leave here today with a couple things. One is a planted seed in your mind around the concept of storytelling and how that might help you in your life or in your profession. And 2, take one thing away from here and try it. Try it at work. Try it in life, see if it works. I'd love to hear whether it does or doesn't, or any feedback at all on this message. Happy to talk after this presentation. So how can security design be similar to or benefit from storytelling, the art of storytelling? But what I first want to cover is what this conversation isn't. This conversation is not about lying. It's not about being deceitful, stretching the truth, or trying to trick somebody into something to get what you want or to get something for your program. To be a good CISO, to be a good security leader, you have to have honesty and integrity. You have to go and be transparent, have to have the right mindset, or you'll never really truly be successful. So then what is it about? It's about one of my favorite lines, I use it all the time, is controlling the narrative and being persuasive in your program. You look at stories affect emotions, and emotions really drive decisions. So if you can affect emotion and drive a good story, you will have more support and be more successful. It's also about having a vision and being able to articulate that vision for your program with a set of stories with your stakeholders. And finally, in a sea of controls and regulations and products and technologies and bad news, it's about making sure people understand what they need to know and defining what good looks like. So I know it's Q1, and I feel like I've spent the entire quarter on Log4j and cyber wars and every other thing that's going on that didn't allow me to really prepare for this presentation. And so it's already going to be an interesting year. I could have called this presentation my worst hits, because the majority of the things I'm going to talk about today are lessons that I learned probably multiple times the hard way. So first, before we dive in, I'm going to talk a little bit about the art or the history of storytelling. storytelling has been around since the beginning of mankind. And the first stories were pictures on cave walls, right? And they were aimed at survival, how to find something to eat and how not to get eaten, right? Fast forward a little bit to the Greeks, and like many modern things, the Greeks took things to the next level, right? With storytelling, it was the same. Think of Homer and the Odyssey and Greek mythology, lots of great stories there. I also think about the spoken word. If you picture back in the day, not too dissimilar to what we're doing today, people standing around in squares and someone standing up on a rock telling a story. And that's how lessons were learned. That's how things were passed down through generations. They also gave us fables and fairy tales. So I have a book at home, Aesop's Fables. Love it. Read it to my kids multiple times. They love it. It's just they're great stories to tell. One of them, a couple of examples are Hansel and Gretel, right? That one's pretty common. You might know that one. What's the message to that fairy tale? It's really, don't get lost in the woods or you might get eaten. Now, although it's funny, and in today's world, it's just a story. At one point in time, it wasn't just a story. That was actually a life lesson. When we had a lot more forest and a lot less people, that was a problem. So fables were really designed, stories were designed to pass lessons on to generations. One of my personal favorites, and a little lesser known, is The Crow and the Pitcher. So if you don't know that one, there's a crow walking by and he's thirsty and he sees a pitcher with some water in it. Tries to get a drink, but he can't reach the water because of his beak. So he's parched, but he sees a pebble. Grabs that pebble, drops it in, the water goes up a little bit, tries again, still can't get to it. He does that again and again and again until that water level rises and he can get a drink. His thirst has been quenched. Right? So what's the lesson there? From a life perspective, I look at that as any goal can be met if you take it a little step at a time. Right? From a work perspective, I look at that and say more of the don't be the office of no. There is always a secure way to get your business partners to the objective that they're trying to get to. Okay? So we can't talk about storytelling and not talk about Shakespeare. Shakespeare, magical words, stories have stand the test of time. But one thing that Shakespeare realized is in his time of life, a lot of people were illiterate, couldn't read. Right? Thus became a big boom of physical enactment and humor and play. Right? So he was able to connect both the mind and the heart. And because of that, his stories will probably go down as being the best playwright of all time, most likely. Right? All the way till today. And you just shout it out if anyone has an answer, but what is the number one storytelling vehicle in today's world? Anyone know? TikTok? No, that's probably number one now. Yeah. In general, social media, right? TikTok, Facebook, YouTube. Everyone now has a platform to tell their story. And for those of you who, maybe like me, occasionally waste 30 minutes of life watching stupid videos on YouTube, sometimes I wonder if that's actually a good thing. Okay? So today I'm going to talk about two categories and try to relate storytelling to security or risk management. First is going to be around leadership, decisioning, and organizational design. And the second set of stories will be tied to stories for our people and for our partners. So first, a little bit of science. Storytelling, a good story anyways, produces a couple chemicals when you're listening to it, dopamine and oxytocin specifically. These chemicals in your body and your mind allow you to have a feeling of relaxation and focus and creativity. So when I'm presenting or going to leadership or asking for a budget or a program approval or project approval, those are really good feelings I would like my decision makers to have to be relaxed and focused. From stakeholders, another scientific fact really is that the more emotionally connected you are to something, the less critical you are of that thing. So if I roll those things together, I would say if you can get your stakeholders emotionally connected to your mission, you're going to have better support for your program. So I want to thank all the vendors. The vendors are here, and they're a big reason why we have these conferences, and we can get together like this and have a conversation. They're probably, they know this message already. This next one is kind of fundamental to what they do, but a good story is the backbone of every marketing strategy. And as a CISO or a security leader, and fair to say that we're really just selling the value of security to our organization and to our decision makers. So again, what story are you selling? Talk a little bit about messaging. Oh, here it is. Messaging to the board. Maybe I shouldn't move. Messaging to the board or to leadership, could be an audit committee or even just your executive leadership, can be challenging. Right? It's a tricky thing to manage. You go into a board, you might not know if you have what level of technical competency you're going to be talking to. Right? It could be a board with just all business leaders who really don't understand tech, certainly don't understand security. Maybe you have a CIO on the board and they speak your language. Or what I hope that we continue to see is that we have advisors or board members that are ex-CISOs, and that makes our life a little easier when you're presenting. But you have to be able to adapt your message to different levels of understanding depending on who you're talking to. Another problem is timing. You never really know if you're going to have 10 minutes or 60 minutes when you go in. And I've had presentations where I thought I was going in for a 15-minute quick update, and an hour and a half later, we were talking about probability of financial loss through our cyber risk scenarios. Now, that was my favorite board meeting ever. The more time you get, the better. It means they're emotionally connected. I've had the opposite, where I spend weeks putting together 5, 10 slide deck, half an hour presentation, and you walk in and you get 3 minutes. So do what you can do in 3 minutes. Essentially, you have to be ready to adapt to your message. But most importantly, you still have to come across with a consistent message, no matter how you're presenting it. Because if you go in every quarter into the board or into your leadership group with a different story, a different understanding of your program, you're going to look incompetent. And that's not a good place to be. Another tip that's something that I find fundamental, many of you probably do this, if not, try it, is utilizing breach reports. This is something that's worked for me for years, and I love to do it. There's a lot of great information in there. I'm particularly fond of the Verizon data breach report. I think it's very data-driven. Also know a few people who were part of that when they were building it out. And the majority of your leadership aren't going to take the time to read and look at that. There's a lot of valuable information in there. So every year I make it a point to really deeply analyze it, look at it. How has the threat changed? And are you seeing that in your program? All right? Or over the last year, I would assume with the money that you're spending, you've increased or decreased your susceptibility, and you're able now to better resist that threat. How can you pull all that together into a narrative and summarize that 60-page document into a half-an-hour conversation so you can get that in front of your leadership? Because I found that to be a very successful way to get visibility and get support. Now, stories generally have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you think about the story I opened with, or just any movie or book that you might have read, there's a pretty common pattern to some stories. You start over here with your protagonist, kind of going along, doing their thing. Something happens, right? Some kind of antagonistic force comes into play. Maybe it's a bad guy coming in, and it brings them down. This is where the drama starts to happen in the story. And maybe a hero swoops in, or maybe your protagonist pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and climbs out of the problem. And ultimately goes off in the sunset and has a good ending. It's a pretty common pattern if you think about that from across a lot of movies, generically. Why not tell your security strategy in a similar kind of a narrative, right? And it doesn't exact match, but if you think of here's where we are. This is our current maturity. This is our current program now. Yeah, we've got some gaps. We've got some problems, some issues. Maybe a force came in. Maybe we had a breach. Or we had some close calls. Pay attention to your close calls, your near misses, because there's a lot of good data in there. Now we're planning. We're getting some resources. We're coming up with a plan. We're making some progress, closing things out. Ultimately, this is where we're trying to go. This is our vision for where we're going to be. Now in security, that vision really never gets materialized. You never actually get there. So you're really kind of going through this pattern over and over again. Right? To me, it kind of related back to stories that I loved when I was a kid, which was the choose your own adventure. You're going to run into this random end unexpectedly, and then you get to start over again and do the same thing. So we'll talk a little bit about the operating model of your program. What are the security services and capabilities that make up your program? Do you have them written down? Are they documented? Are they effective, and can you show it? Are they mandatory or optional? So if you think of things like incident response or threat intelligence, those are kind of peanut butter spread across the enterprise or enterprise level capabilities. You don't get to choose to use that as a business unit, you just get it. But you might have an identity access management program where if you build it, they will come. They come and utilize it, but maybe the business units don't have to. As long as they're meeting the requirements, they don't have to use your centralized capability. What is the value they're providing? This is the word you'll probably hear me use and overuse today. It's one of my favorite words. What value are those capabilities providing? They're not all created equal. Some are more important than others. And can you explain that value? Can you show it if someone asks you? So a CIO that I know one time came to me when I tried explaining our security strategy and our security program, and it was pretty crystal clear. If you don't have it written down, it doesn't exist. If you don't know what those things are, if you don't have it written down, other people can't consume it. You might think they know what your model is, but they probably don't. And on that note, do your stakeholders actually know how they fit in your world, how they work in your operating model? If you think of it from a governance structure and a governance framework, who and how are you making decisions in your organization for security? Right? Who's at the seat of the table? Who's really truly making that? You might think it's you, but it probably isn't. Right? Who's accountable for governance? Who's making sure we're doing what we say we're going to be doing? And how do you enforce adoption? It's easy to write a policy and a set of standards and say these are the rules of the road. It's the first thing, every time I built a program, that's the first thing you do. But how do you ensure people buy into that message and they actually adopt those requirements? So related to stakeholders, let's call them characters for a moment. I apologize, I keep looking down and it gets louder. Characters are the lifeblood of a story. Just about any writer would tell you that. And for example, Kurt Vonnegut is an American playwright, a fairly successful one, and he used to teach creative writing. And one thing that he called out to his creative writing classes was that right away at the beginning of your story, you need to make your main character want something. That's what brings the readers in. That's what brings the message home, brings it home. If you think of this in relation to movies, even a lot of movie titles are actually titled The Main Character. That's just how a lot of our movies are even named. That's how characters are so important in our stories. If you think of myself, I'm a movie buff, also a movie buff with a pretty bad memory. So, I've done this many times, so if this might resonate with you or not, but you're out having a beverage, talking to friends, hanging out, and it's like, God, you remember that movie? That one movie, it's got that lady in it, she's super funny, always dancing and singing, and someone's like, oh, you mean so-and-so? Yes, thank you, right? We even remember movies, not generally because of the plot, but we remember it because of the main character. So in your security story, do you know who your characters are? Who are your stakeholders? Are you talking to them regularly? How often are you meeting with legal and HR and internal audit and enterprise risk and on all the non-technical functions of your business? You need to care and feed those relationships because that's really where a lot of the support comes from. So this next lesson is one that I've learned multiple times over, and an old mentor of mine, a CISO that I reported to, beat this into me multiple times. That is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Right? Telling a story of progress is the way I like to say it as well. So when I'm part of my first manager role, when I was a manager of a small security team, I was a manager, not a leader. I was actually not a very good manager the first couple times I tried it. It's because I was shooting for perfection all the time. We did a lot of great work. It was a great team. We were successful. We produced the things that we were supposed to produce. But instead of taking the win, I looked at the things we did wrong. Well, how are we not perfect? Yes, we met our objective, but we could have been better. And that negative mindset didn't help the team, right? Didn't help myself, didn't help the team. And my boss at the time kind of made me aware of that, and something I changed over time. Learn how to take a win, right? Perfection is really not attainable in our world. So you can try and you can shoot for that, but make sure that you know when good enough is good enough. So the second category of stories is around our people and our partners. Right? So how many of you have tried to explain a security capability or a technology or a control to someone non-technical and failed miserably? Right? I mean, I should probably put both hands up, right? Many, many times. And I mean, were you talking about the business outcome, or were you talking about the technical components? And I mean to go a little deeper here than just don't use acronyms, right? Don't use fancy technical words. Oftentimes I've found, and I've done this in the past as well, make sure you spell the acronym out, or make sure you try to explain what that word means. But how about just not using those words at all, right? purely talk in business speak. I have a couple examples. The first one, you go in and talk to somebody about, I'm going to give you an update on our identity and access management program. Now, this one might not be the best example, because at this point in time, most of our stakeholders probably know what that is. It's fairly logical to understand. They probably know what the words mean. They might not necessarily know all the underpinnings of what IAM stands for. Or you could go in and have a conversation and say, I want to talk to you about how we ensure that the people who have access to the things that you care about are monitored and are appropriate. Right? Those are regular words that anyone can understand. I didn't need to use any technical talk at all. My favorite one is network segmentation, or segmentation in general. I've done many segmentation projects through my days. It's a very valuable and important control. And many times, this is where I failed multiple times, explaining this, I use terms like firewall rule policies, bastion hosts, one of my favorite ones to explain, VLANs, or even use the identity-based network access words to somebody and watch their face melt a little bit, like, I think I know what you're talking about, but I don't really know what you're talking about. Or why don't you just use a simple analogy and take, maybe the person you're talking to is a car person, right? They like cars. So just ask them, take them through an analogy and say, you have this brand new fancy high-end Tesla. I'm not a car guy, so I don't know the models of the Tesla, but are you going to park it in your driveway? I mean, you've got locks on it. It's got an alarm system. You're right there in your house, and you live in a great neighborhood, so there's probably that many threats around. It doesn't really matter what the answer is. They might say yes or no. But then say, okay, take that Tesla away and say it's a brand new, custom, one-of-a-kind, $300,000 Lamborghini, custom built for you. Still going to park it in your driveway? Maybe. Or are you going to put it in your garage? Maybe put up some fencing with some barbed wire, maybe some lights, maybe a couple Doberman sitting inside that fence, right? So what have you done? You've segmented. You put layers of access and controls in between the threats and your critical asset. That's a way, a little fruity, but a way to get a point across to someone who is versus using the technical terms. Another thing that I found pretty successful, and many of you are probably doing this at this point in time, but making security personal. That's the tagline we use at Freddie for it. But when it comes to security awareness is boring. Always has been, always probably will be. We try to make it engaging. We do a pretty good job sometimes of doing that. But at the end of the day, someone who's written all those trainings and get annoyed every time I have to take them, even though everyone has to take them. We've all been there. Try to take a topic and make it personally related to the individual. I've done this at my organization. I've also done this at children's school and at churches. So talk about why it's important and how you can protect your children's internet traffic, monitoring their internet traffic to protect them. Or how to use multi-factor authentication to protect your personal banking and investments. People will learn because they're interested, because they're protecting themselves or their family. That piece of their interest, it resonates with them. But you're really teaching them the mindset, and you're teaching them the lessons that they will inevitably bring back to your organization and use there as well. And it's going to be more effective than another 45-minute awareness training. So I have a younger person that used to work with me one time, and he came in, and this is more about kind of telling a story of value. A 24-year-old kid, one of the best hires I've ever had, just really good, worked hard, very hungry, throw anything at him and he would get it done. He came in one day and he's like, Jeff, I got my MBA. It's like, great, good for you. Like I've done that well. I understand the time, the dedication, the after hours, what you have to do to make that happen. So good on you. Good job. I was thinking about talking about a raise. Oh, great. Okay, why's that? Well, because I got my MBA. I'm like, well, again, good job, good for you. That's going to make you more valuable in the market, and I'm proud of you for doing that. What does that do for me right now, and what does that do for this organization? And before you answer that, it's a little aggressive of a response, but I want you to think for a second of all the value that you've brought this organization since you've been here. I agree you deserve a raise. I'll just start with that. I want you to come back in a week, and I want you to tell me why you actually think you deserve it, and it's not because you got an MBA. And he did, and ultimately he got that raise and worked for a few more years before, unfortunately, in this market we lost him. So it's just part of our world. But I still talk to him, in fact, trying to hire him again right now, as a matter of fact. I've talked about this before, and he said what he learned that day was more than just the raise. It was he understood then how to talk about the value he brings to the organization, and that made him more valuable. And many of us aren't good at doing that. So think about that for a little bit. Focus, what do you bring to the organization? Make sure you can tell that story and you'll be more personally successful. This next one is around judgment. I mean, everyone wants to not be a judgmental person, and all of us are judgmental to some degree. But keeping judgment out of your stories. What I mean by this is, we all change roles, we all go to new organizations, and I know I've been guilty of this a few times as well. But how many have come into a new role and looked around, see the lay of the land of the program and be like, what the hell was the person before me doing? This is the worst program I've ever seen, right? Savior complex comes out, I'm going to do this, I'm going to fix this. This person was terrible. But then take a step back and be honest. When you left that same role, was it perfect? Did you fix everything? Or maybe you didn't, because for the same reason the person before you didn't, because it could have been lack of resources, could have been lack of leadership support, maybe risk appetite. The organization just didn't need the program that you thought they needed. This job is really hard, right? So we all know this. Being in security is exciting, it's changing, but it's also really difficult, can be very draining. So let's be nice to each other. Let's keep it positive. Let's talk a little bit about metrics or written storytelling, is essentially what I like to call it. Not drastically different than those metrics and those dashboards you have. It's just another drawing on the cave wall. What is it that you're trying to tell with those metrics? Right? Oftentimes we start with just throwing everything out there that we can get, all your operational metrics. Some of them might be helpful, some of them probably don't mean much. So take it deeper than operational metrics. Really, less is really more when it comes to this space, to make sure that they're meaningful and that they're actually saying something. Look at what you have, and if you can't figure out what the purpose is or what the action is that you think that metric should be driving, depending on if you're above or below the threshold line or wherever you're aging or whatever you're looking at, maybe you should reevaluate if you should be actually tracking that metric. Start over. So a couple examples. The obvious and easy one that many people have made, and I hope most of us have fixed at this point in time, is we have 100,000 critical vulnerabilities in our environment. Is that good or bad? It seems like it's bad, but I don't really know for sure. Are they exploitable? I would like to know that. How do they affect our risk? It's a big challenge. I don't know that I've fully solved and cracked that nut on how to exactly tie vulnerability back to risk. That's a tough one. How many assets do you have? Do you have 2,000 assets or do you have 50,000 assets? Because then when you look at that number, it's a whole different conversation when you look at number of vulnerabilities per asset, which is another way to look at it. And then ultimately, and probably most important, are the vulnerabilities on the assets that matter the most to the organization? The bottom line really we're trying to get to here is when it comes to vulnerability management, content is king. You've got to have the context. Right? You have to understand the story behind it. And one thing that we look for in my current role when we talk about vulnerability metrics is your metrics and your story should be aimed around how are you fixing the vulnerabilities that matter the most to your organization effectively, because you can't fix everything. We've all tried for a long time, we've all failed. So that's where you should focus your efforts. This next one is my personal favorite. I'm not going to ask everyone to raise their hand, but if this is you, raise your hand. I'd be interested in talking to you after this presentation. But in your program, in your company, your metrics program, or at your organization, does anyone in here not track the phishing click rate? No hands? No surprise? I'm sure I've ever seen a hand when I've asked that question before. So the assumption with this metric is that it measures our effectiveness of our awareness training or our phishing training. Maybe it does. Probably does right away. And the first time you roll this out, I've done this a few times, right? If you have that 35% click rate the first time, right? The next time, a couple months in, a couple quarters in, you get it down to 15%, and look at how good I am. Look at the risk we're reducing in this organization. I'm just saving the day. And take that win if you can, because that's a nice win to take. But in reality, once you've done it for 2 or 3 years, eventually you start to level off. You only see a moderate up and down, a couple percentage points up and down on your phishing click rate. Is it really still tracking what we thought it was? Right? If you consistently get under 5%, does that mean you have to stop worrying about phishing? No longer need to worry about that threat? Probably not. All right. How about an alternative approach to this? And that is, take me through a storyboard from all bad things coming in to email, all the way over to someone clicked on a phishing link and it actually caused me a loss, right? And storyboard that out. Just kind of taking you through that a little bit. And I'll caveat it, of course, to know that there's always unknown unknowns. These numbers are not perfect. There's always the opportunity that a fish got through, completely evaded our technology, somebody clicked on it, got completely out, and we didn't know about it. And there's always that. There's no perfect in our metrics, but it's still directionally sound. What gets into our environment? We have a lot of email. What, 94% of it is malicious, whatever those numbers tend to be. Start there. So then now we know what gets to the mailbox. So what gets to the mailbox, let's say John in accounting over here clicks on a phishing link, and I think we covered this in Dark Trace, I believe, so they talked about this a little bit. Clicked on a link. Oh, we now know that's bad. We know that email's bad, reputation, we find that link, we find a way for our solution stack to know that this is now bad. So now we're going to go over here before anyone has a chance to click anything else, and we're going to wipe it out. So that's a great story to tell. We just used automation and got smarter and reduced the threat without having to do anything manually. Like telling that story to leadership. But just because somebody clicks on something doesn't mean that we have, well, first off, we go back to actual click rate, right? With that information, you could get an actual click rate. We know roughly what came in the mailbox. We know roughly what people clicked. Now I can generate an actual real-life click rate. To me, the one that matters a lot more than the one that we tested. But if someone does click, it also doesn't mean you have a bad day. Did something block it on the way out? Are other defense and depth controls and solutions on the way out stop something from getting out and being a bad day? Or maybe somebody clicked on something, got there, realized it was phishing, didn't put their password in, let the security team know, right? The desired security behavior that we want. Good for us, our training's working. Ultimately, all the way over to the right, and what I've advised on different scenarios that I've talked to is, I want to know either the number or the percentage of times when someone clicked on a phishing link and it actually caused us to have a system or credential compromise. That's where we actually start having loss. The rest of it before that, it's just data. So that's a way that you can look at that. Maybe you do both. We still do both. Of course, we have clicking rate because ERM would never let us get rid of it. Or you could just keep putting that click rate up there and keep acting as though you don't know that if you really wanted to, you could get back up to 30% anytime you wanted to by crafting a very custom phishing attack at the right time frame. So one last tip on metrics, and this is something that just recently a team member brought my attention that I really liked. And he was working on our dashboards, and one thing he came up with was something he does for all of his metrics. As he sits, looks at the metric, grabs his phone, puts a minute on his timer, and then puts the metric down and tries to explain it for a minute. What's the value of this? Why am I reporting it? What does it mean? What's the action? And at the end of that minute, if he can't come up with a good story, his recommendation is that that metric might not be very good. It seems kind of simple, but it was, I did it a couple times, and it was pretty valuable. All right, risk quantification, the ultimate security storytelling, if you will. So many of you in this room I know, and if you know me, you know that I'm strongly on the side of the growing minority that the majority of our cyber and IT risk management practices are inadequate. I'll be nice since we're on video. They're too subjective, there's no rigor, there's a whole lot of finger in the air going on. I'm a huge fan of risk quantification. We leverage FAIR, but there's many models out there that you can look at. And it's not the math, it's not even the math that's the biggest win in this area. It's the process, it's the rigor that we go through, the detailed critical thinking, the data analysis, and looking at how these things, how these controls actually apply to us. Not all controls apply to all risks. And that's the value, and going through that process is what allows you to have a good risk story and be able to present that, which ultimately leads to better risk analysis than just kind of putting your finger in the air and picking a box. But that's a whole different presentation, one that I enjoy giving. I'm trying to do something different today, so I'm not going to go into risk quantification today, another time. So I hope I've given a couple examples of where storytelling can tie into security. But let's just talk about a couple tips on just how to become a storyteller. I'm going to give 3 tips. And the first one is by far fundamentally the most important one. And that's believing that you can do it, right? I believe that this is inherently in all of us. Being able to tell a story, it's in our DNA. You're probably good at it when you're with your friends or when you're with your family. It's more difficult when you're standing up in front of a room. But you have to believe that you can do it. That's step 1. Step 2 is write them down and inventory them. What are the stories and what kind of an emotion do they create for the people that you're telling them to? And keep those. We all do it on the situational interviewing, right? Tell me a time when blah, blah, blah. We have those stories ready because we do that before we interview, right? Why not do that all the time? You're trying to get a certain decision made or trying to get someone to approve or agree on a certain direction or project, and you want to invoke a certain emotion, tie it to a story that generally invokes that emotion, and you might be more successful in getting the outcome that you're looking for. And third is just start doing it. Might start with yourself in a mirror. Again, might start with the people that you trust. Try to listen to other people that are having conversations and catch on when someone's really just telling a story and they don't even realize it, because a lot of times that's what happens. And the more you practice this, right, practice makes progress. A couple tips also on how to tell a good story and how to make your storytelling effective. One is don't pack too much in and don't rush it. So for this, I have a funny story, and just I'm going to wave and say hi to my family in case they're watching. My kids are on break, and they were interested in maybe watching Dad present, so we opened up the Teams link before I left. So if you're watching, hi. I'm going to do that because I'm about to talk about my daughter. But she's a talker. She's just like her dad. She's a talker. And she'll come home and want to tell me a story about her day or about a friend, and it will go on for some time. And she is the queen of tangents and a whole bunch of details that are completely unrelated to the point she's trying to make about the day. She's kind of just rambling. Now, I'm blessed, and obviously for me, I'm going to listen to that story as long as she's willing to tell it to me, because that's great. Right? But I also find that I need to help teach her scenarios where those couple points you made, they probably weren't fundamental to your story. Maybe you could have been a little more effective in your delivery. Just try to teach her how to be a better storytelling, because not everyone's going to love listening to her stories as much as I do. Next tip would be use relevant examples. And we talked about this a little bit already, but the more you can make something relatable to someone, the more they're going to listen. So if I'm going into a Fortune 50 financial institution board, I may or may not want to talk about a breach that happened on some small private manufacturing company in a different country. Might not be very relevant to the conversation. Not saying it isn't, but maybe it is. Make sure that if you do that when you're telling your stories, you have a relation to the topic and that you're bringing that to your stakeholders so they can relate to it if you want to be effective. And last, this one you can't teach. This is just passion, right? Are you truly passionate about what you're about to tell a story about or what you're talking about? Are you hungry for what you like to do? Do you really love what you want to do? Because most people aren't good at faking it, and you can tell when someone's faking it. So I hope it didn't look like I'm faking it today. But so really focus on that. Make sure you're covering the content that's something that you're passionate about, and that will really have. If you can build that hunger, you can keep that in your life or in your professional. That will come out through your work and through your stories. So I hope I was able to pique your interest today a little bit about storytelling and how it connects to our world. One final thought that I'll leave you with is, we don't do security just for security's sake. How do your programs integrate with the mission and purpose of your business? We are there for them. It's the reason we exist. At Freddie Mac, we make home possible. That's our company's vision. So my team and our team, we're not just bits and bytes protecting the assets and the data. We make it possible so that our organization can provide homes to millions of people, and that's what our program does. So I might have been a little faster than I expected to there. It always goes faster live, but thank you for your time today, and happy to have a conversation with them after this if you want to keep that going. Thank you. And think if you have questions, we do have 15 minutes. Fire away. If not, catch up after lunch. Any questions? All right. Thank you.